I was an intern at the WCC in 2010 for a short time, and I think their greatest gift to their member churches and to their people is to be a facilitating role. They're one of the only kind of eagle-eye views from the top on a global ecumenical level that we have. The difficulty for the WCC is that there's so many issues and there's so many contexts, and how are you possibly going to have a value-based judgment that says Indigenous people are more important than Dalits, or sexual orientation and sexual issues of gender equality are more important than climate change. You can't. You can't level those issues on a scale of 1 to 10, and you certainly can't speak for everyone in every context. It's an impossibility. Though there are certain injustices that the WCC does choose to speak on, does choose to make statements on, and in some contexts that is more powerful and more helpful than in other contexts. But I think it's more about an awareness for me personally, coming from a Hawaii context, coming from an Indigenous context. What is somebody else doing in Africa, and how has that been successful and not? Or in Canada, and how has that been successful and not? Because there's only a few places that we get to do that. So I think it's more about facilitating our learning from one another than our waiting on a overhead statement that's often very broad and can be inconclusive. What makes Indigenous issues so pressing is that Indigenous people tend to be the ones who are affected the most by issues like climate change, by issues like clean drinking water, HIV/AIDS, things like that. So what we're asking for is not that issues get addressed that affect only Indigenous people, but that more prudently, that in issues that we are already discussing, Indigenous people have a place, and Indigenous people are recognized in their struggles within those systems. What's difficult is Indigenous people are often disenfranchised racially, economically, structurally, and so it's not so much about saying, homelessness is an Indigenous issue. It's more about recognizing homelessness is an issue in our communities, and often Indigenous people bear the brunt of that. Or imprisonment is an issue in our communities, and often Indigenous people have a staggeringly high statistic. In our pre-assembly, we talked a lot about land and water rights, and I'd say across the board, we were all affected by land, but in a myriad of ways. There were people from the Pacific who were concerned about rising sea levels because their land is getting swallowed by the ocean. There were people in West Papua who were concerned that they are being forcibly removed. It's not a matter of saying rising sea levels are affecting all Indigenous peoples, but I think you can put a broader context, climate change or land loss, and find something that connects with each person. I come from a Native Hawaiian context, and we don't have the understanding of one creator. We have an understanding of many different gods and goddesses and demigods, and they fooled around with humans all the time, and so that's really hard to look at that. And for me, that's my mother's family's tradition, that's her bloodline, and I know it's truth somewhere in my gut. I know it in my now. And yet, I also know and completely believe in Jesus and the gospel, and completely a part of my Christian tradition. And so the weaving of these two ropes is not like a braid or something that's neat. It's like, you know, sometimes I pull a clump there and then I take a string, and sometimes I'm pulling a clump and taking a string. You know, it's not something that neatly goes hand in hand, that I can go, oh, we have this story of a man coming and that's kind of Jesus-ish. And, you know, some people can, and that's how they've married the two. I think it's more about respecting and I find Hawaiian thought in Christian doctrine, and I find Christian doctrine in Hawaiian thought and tradition, like in respecting all people and respecting the dignity of each human being. And that's part of the ecumenical movement, right? Is respecting, okay, what he believes is like vastly different than what I believe, but I respect how he came to that. I respect that that's his choice, and I expect him to respect my choice and my reasons as well.